The movie begins with a woman named Elizabeth who ties up and kills a man named Frank because he forced himself on her in front of her son. Oh, she got big badonkadonks. She laughs maniacally and then takes a shower in Frank's house. The next morning, she sets the house on fire with Frank's body still inside. Meanwhile, in another city, a young boy named Scott comes home to a surprise party thrown by his parents and extended family because he got accepted into Brown University. They all tell him how proud they are of him, and it seems like a happy family. His dad, Eddie, brings him a cake. Yo, that's Marcus Houston, and he hasn't aged much. At night, his mom, April, speaks with him about his passion for music and reminds him of her advice to always write down his poems, saying Tupac was a poet first. Soon, Eddie interrupts and shows off his breakdancing skills. April says he got 2 left feet even though we know the truth. April takes up the challenge to show him who's boss, but suddenly collapses and stops breathing. A year later, Scott and Eddie move to a new town, where Eddie's older brother helps them get a new house for a fresh start. Eddie tells Harrison that Scott decided not to go to college to stay with him for a while. Harrison then tells Eddie he got him a job at his bowling alley so he can get his mind off things. While the movers are unpacking, Scott rushes down and scolds one of the men for touching a box that contains some personal belongings that must have been his mom's. As he reflects, a beautiful girl walks by, momentarily distracting him from his sadness. You better riz that girl up. At the bowling alley, where Eddie now works as a manager, Elizabeth, who has changed her look and now calls herself Zoe, asks for directions. Yo, that's Erica Mina from the assistant. Eddie is too stunned to speak because she dropped dead gorgeous, but quickly regains composure and helps her. They start talking, and Zoe learns that Eddie is also new in town. Zoe asks about his wife when she sees his ring, and Eddie explains that his wife passed away. She apologizes, and they soon talk about how important it is for him to keep wearing the ring. The doorbell rings, and it turns out to be Jessica, who comes to introduce herself, joking that it's rude to stare. Jessica's mom soon calls her away, and Scott lies down on his bed with a goofy-ass smile on his face. The next morning, Scott has so much energy that Eddie immediately asks him who the girl is. That afternoon, Jessica visits Scott, and he raps a new piece he wrote for his mom. When she asks, he tells her his mom passed away, and Jessica apologizes. They soon start talking about how cool his mom was, and Jessica says Tupac transitioned from indie pop to hip hop. Girl, is that for real? At a diner, Eddie has lunch with Zoe, who tells him about herself. Zoe mentions she's never found the right man, and Eddie drops a line about how he never thought about being with another woman after his wife's death until he met her. I don't know about that wig though, Zoe. That night, Eddie talks with Harrison and Vanessa to get their opinions about Zoe. Vanessa keeps it 100 and suggests that Eddie get to know her better before making any serious decisions, especially since she can't find Zoe on social media. Harrison tells Eddie he's happy for him, but Eddie needs to keep Scott in the loop. Later, Scott introduces Jessica to Eddie. Eddie then shows Scott his new car, but Scott is an unappreciative little shit. Eventually, Scott gives Jessica a ride. No, get your mind out the gutter. Days later, Eddie and Zoe go bowling with Harrison and Vanessa. Vanessa celebrates her win by forcing Jessica to take a picture with her. Your girl Vanessa is out here playing chess with that picture. While chilling, Eddie tells Harrison he thinks Zoe is the one, but struggles with the idea of being with another woman. Harrison tells him he deserves to move on. Meanwhile, Scott takes Jessica to Rudy's place to give Rudy some donuts. Jessica introduces Scott, and Rudy warns them to be careful because he's been watching too much Netflix documentaries. Scott gets home and finds Zoe there. Eddie awkwardly tries to introduce them, but Scott gets angry and asks her to leave because he hasn't heard anything about her. Scott storms out, and Eddie apologizes to Zoe. The next morning, Eddie apologizes to Scott for not telling him about dating because he didn't know how to approach it. Scott tells him he understands that Eddie must get tired using his hand, but wishes he had been told about Zoe sooner. Weeks later, Zoe is cooking breakfast for everyone, and the smell wins everyone over, even Scott. When everyone leaves, Zoe has a heart-to-heart conversation with Scott, telling him she doesn't intend to replace his mom, but loves his dad and his dad's D. She hopes they can build a bond over time. This makes Scott smile. 6 months later, Eddie and Zoe get married and Zoe moves in. One night, Zoe sneakily takes some medication and leaves as if nothing happened. Later, Rudy talks with Eddie and mentions seeing a woman on an unsolved mystery show who looks like Zoe. Zoe interrupts the conversation, and Rudy changes the subject. After Rudy leaves, Zoe and Rudy exchange tense looks. Eddie jokes to Zoe about Rudy's suspicions, but Zoe laughs it off. Days later, Rudy is found dead under a car. When Scott and Jessica arrive, the police tell them the car fell on him. At the police station, 2 officers discuss the murders of 3 men who were all widowers with teenage sons. The suspect, who goes by several aliases, is known as Elizabeth. She was a victim of assault by Frank, who forced himself on her in front of her teenage son, Jason. After the house caught fire from a stove accident, Elizabeth and Jason barely survived. The case was dismissed due to a lack of evidence, and Jason was too traumatized to testify. A few weeks later, Jason committed suicide, and Elizabeth broke into Frank's house, killed him, and set it on fire. At home, Eddie and Zoe argue about their honeymoon destination, and she overreacts, threatening to make him sleep on the couch. Zoe retreats to the closet to regain her composure. Eddie later talks to her privately, telling her not to cause a scene in front of Scott, and she profusely apologizes. That night, Zoe urgently calls her supplier, demanding a refill on her meds, screaming that it's already been a week. She starts shaking and struggles to calm herself down. The next morning, Scott is woken up by a loud alarm and finds Zoe glaring at him. She coldly tells him breakfast is ready and reminds him that she's now the woman of the house and things will change. At breakfast, Zoe explains that she set the alarm in Scott's room because she wants them to eat breakfast together as a family. That's what dinner's for. Scott tells Eddie he's too old to wake up at 7 a.m. for breakfast. When Eddie says Zoe is just trying to create a family bond, Scott angrily retorts that they already are a real family, then storms off. Zoe starts sobbing, and Eddie reassures her that she's doing great and everything is okay. Held to the no, Zoe is overstepping as a stepmom. One night, they are playing Twister, but Zoe gets triggered about her past and screams at the family. Zoe opens up about how abusive her ex was. Weeks later, Eddie goes on a business trip for the weekend. He tells Zoe that he gave Vanessa her details for a receptionist job, trying to help her in her job search. Zoe looks uncomfortable with her information being shared, but forces a smile. I bet bitch ass don't want to work either. Zoe then argues with Scott, calling him son and telling him he'll need to start calling her mommy soon. As she starts to get worked up, Scott steps back and apologizes for upsetting her. He tries to get her to leave, but Zoe sees Jason and mistakenly calls him Jason and quickly covers it up by saying Jason was a boy she used to teach. Zoe again oversteps and tries to make Scott accept that she's his new mommy. That night, Scott tries searching for information about Zoe online, but finds nothing. He tells Jessica about the odd things happening and suspects Zoe may be the woman Rudy warned him about. Jessica gaslights him and tells him to get her ass some soda instead. When Scott gets home, he overhears Zoe telling someone she misses him and she'll come see him by 8 the next day. The next morning, Vanessa calls to tell her the information Eddie gave her isn't valid and asks her to send a copy of her license or social security. Zoe looks shocked, but promises to get the information to her today. Zoe lying. Vanessa better do some investigation. Moments later, Scott asks Zoe to join him and Jessica for a movie at 8 to confirm his suspicions, but she lies and says she has plans to clean up the house. Meanwhile, Vanessa calls one of their tech guys and asks him to research the information Eddie provided, as she suspects it might be identity fraud. Then she forwards the picture they took together. Hours later, Zoe comes to Vanessa's office looking very serious and brings the paperwork in person. Vanessa politely answers her, but secretly thinks Zoe is crazy. Late at night, the tech guy tells Vanessa that Zoe's real name is Elizabeth, and she is wanted in 3 states for murder. Vanessa rushes to call Eddie, but Zoe, who had been in the building all day, knocks her down the stairs, causing her to fall to her death. At home, Scott looks through Zoe's things and finds a drug used to treat patients with multiple personality disorder. He shows it to Jessica, but Jessica thinks it's also possible that Zoe is a drug dealer. And that makes it okay, Jessica? Scott becomes impatient and suggests they tail her. At 8, Scott and Jessica follow Zoe's car from behind. They follow her to a man's house, whom she hugs dearly. When they move closer, they find Zoe with the man, talking to the man's son. Zoe tells the boy they plan to get married, and the boy says he's excited as long as he's the best man. Scott and Jessica sneak in when Zoe and the man go out for a date. Jessica is still uncomfortable and asks to leave, but Scott is determined to find evidence. While on their way to the date, Zoe tells her lover she forgot her purse and begs him to turn around. Meanwhile, Scott and Jessica sneak around while the little boy plays video games in his room. Scott soon finds more pills, but they hear the car pulling into the driveway. They quickly rearrange things and hide. Zoe comes in and notices that the picture on the table has been moved. She goes upstairs and asks the boy if he bumped into the table, and he says he thinks he might have. While Zoe and her lover drive to their date, she receives a call from Eddie, who tells her he came home a day early and is at the airport. Zoe lies to her lover, saying she's feeling sick and asks for a rain check. Scott tries to call Eddie to tell him what happened, but the network messes up the call. Scott searches for details about Zoe online, while Jessica gets him a drink downstairs. They stupid asses decide to do a Google search about the killer in the killer's house when Jessica literally lives next door. Zoe soon gets home and knocks them out. Scott wakes up tied up with Zoe, acting like she has several demons in her. Zoe starts to see Jason's face on Scott and alternates between pity and aggression. Suddenly, Eddie walks in the front door, and Zoe goes to welcome him. He wonders why she looks different and is acting odd. She starts to see Frank's face on Eddie. Can we just say that Sis was doing community service? Zoe then begins moving her head around like she's Brenda from Scary Movie 3. Eddie asks her if she's fine and where Scott is. Zoe starts to ask him why he would force her in front of her son, but Eddie is unsure what's going on. Zoe suddenly grabs a vase and knocks Eddie out. This has to be the weakest fall I've ever seen, as Eddie literally lies down in slow motion. Wouldn't want to hurt all that man beauty. Somehow Scott unties himself and jumps at Zoe with a push so weak it looks like he's trying to massage her. They start wrestling until she jumps on his back and gets him in a chokehold. He can't tap out, and she knocks him out with a nearby vase. She ties up Eddie and pours gasoline on him. He tries to tell her he's not Frank, but she gets angrier. Scott suddenly comes down and pretends to be Jason, telling her it's okay. Zoe gets distracted and starts to apologize, but she soon figures out the act. They start wrestling again, and Scott picks her up from behind and does a suplex slam. She manages to overpower him and tries to smash his head, but Jessica suddenly stabs her from behind. This damn gaslighting girlfriend finally redeemed herself. 2 months later, Scott and Jessica surprise Eddie with a Father's Day gift. As they celebrate, they notice another unexpected package left on their porch, marked with a note from Zoe, promising they'll meet some other time. Now, how did Zoe get out of prison? Good question. It's mine too. But don't worry, this is part of a 3-movie series, and we'll explain everything, if you're brave enough to stick around for the next one. What did y'all think of this one?
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.